In 1946, the United States Navy deliberately sank some of the most advanced submarines ever built. Not because they were damaged, and not because they were dangerous, but because they didn't want the Soviet Union to see what was inside them. And this is what's left of it, lying 2,300 feet down, exactly where the United States Navy put it in 1946. You see, the country it was built to attack sank it themselves. The I-401 wasn't just a submarine. I'm talking about the largest submarine ever built at that point in history. It was a weapon designed to end the war in a single operation, by launching aircraft to prevent the US Navy from fighting a two-ocean war. And the fact that it never fired a single shot is the most interesting part of this whole story. The I-400 class. Japan called them the Sentoku, were unlike anything that had ever been built.
Let's look at that. These submarines were 400 feet long, 122 meters. Now, to put that in context, that is way longer than a football field.
They were the largest submarines in the world, and they would hold that record for nearly 2 decades until nuclear submarines came along in the 1960s. But the size wasn't the point. The point was what they carried inside. Each I-400 had a pressurized, watertight hangar built directly into the hull, big enough to hold 3 Aichi M6A Seiran floatplane bombers. Folded wings, folded tail, packed in like a loaded gun. The crew could have those aircraft assembled, fueled, armed, and launched in under 30 minutes. All from the surface of the ocean. The submarine would then dive and disappear before anyone could track it. It was an aircraft carrier, except this one could vanish.
Now, the original plan was brutally simple. Japan needed to cut America's ability to move warships between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And of course, the only choke point that mattered was the Panama Canal.
The I-400s were designed to cross the Pacific submerged, surface off the coast of Panama, launch their aircraft, and bomb the canal's locks. After all, without working locks, the canal becomes useless. And the United States would be forced to choose: fight Japan in the Pacific, or fight Germany in the Atlantic. But not both. Not at the same time. Another factor was the sheer psychological impact. Bombing the continental United States, or infrastructure vital to it, in 1942, 1943, would have been devastating to American morale. After all, the attack on Pearl Harbor had already done that once. The Panama Canal Strike Plan called for 4 aircraft carrying submarines: the I-400, the I-401, the I-13, and the I-14. They were to sail eastward across the Pacific to the Gulf of Panama. The journey was expected to take 2 months. The submarines would launch their Seiran aircraft without floats and would attack the locks of the Panama Canal at dawn. After completing their bombing runs, the Seirans were to return to a rendezvous point and ditch alongside the waiting submarines. However, around April of 1945, Captain Arizumi, the man planning the attack, decided the Seiran pilots would make kamikaze ramming attacks against the gates of the Panama Canal, rather than conventional bombing runs, which was a tactic becoming increasingly common as the war went against the Japanese. This was kept secret from the other pilots, At the end of May, however, one pilot happened to observe a Seiran having its bomb release mechanism removed and replaced with a fixed mount. The pilots immediately realizing the implications. They were now on a no-return mission.
But the mission changed because the war shifted against Japan in 1944. And as a result, the Panama Canal plan was quietly dropped. But what replaced it was way darker.
There was a proposal pushed by Shiro Ishii, the man behind Unit 731, to use the I-400s to deliver biological weapons to the United States. Plague-infected fleas, cholera, to be dropped by the Seiran aircraft over American cities and farmland. The operation was called Cherry Blossoms at Night, and it was scheduled for September 22nd, 1945. However, Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945, 38 days before it would have launched. But before surrender, there was one final mission. The I-400s were sent to attack the American fleet at Ulithi Atoll. At that point, one of the largest concentrations of U.S. naval power in the Pacific. Hundreds of ships. The fleet preparing for the invasion of Japan. The I-401, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Nobukiyo Nambu, was en route. The Seiran aircraft were armed, and the crew knew what they were doing. And as a result, they knew the odds of coming back.
Because the reason this mission was so unusual is that the Seiran aircraft on this run, they weren't coming back to the submarine. The plan was for the pilots to ditch in the ocean after their attack run. No return flight, no rescue.
And then on August 15th, there was a radio signal. The Emperor of Japan had announced surrender. Lieutenant Commander Nambu of the I-401 ordered the Seiran aircraft thrown overboard. He didn't want them captured. He didn't want American intelligence to see them. Then he surfaced the I-401 and surrendered to the USS Segundo. The U.S. Navy was fascinated. They brought the I-400 and the I-401 back to Pearl Harbor. Senior engineers toured them. Naval architects measured everything. These submarines represented technology the United States hadn't come close to developing.
You see, the idea of a submarine that could deliver aircraft and strike targets thousands of miles from its home base, well, there's no question, that concept had enormous implications.
It wasn't just a World War II weapon. It was a blueprint for something much more powerful in a world that was about to enter the nuclear age. But the Potsdam Agreement required the United States to share captured Japanese military hardware with the Soviet Union. And the Soviets were demanding to see the I-400s. The US refused.
And I mean, let's look at that decision. The Cold War hadn't officially started yet, but the thinking behind it already had, and American military leadership looked at those submarines and understood immediately what the Soviets would do with that technology.
So in late 1945 and early 1946, the United States Navy quietly scuttled every I-400 class submarine they had captured, sank them in deep water off Hawaii, all before Soviet inspectors could get anywhere near them. Now, the unintended result is that some of the most advanced naval technology ever built during World War II was now sitting on the ocean floor. And almost nobody knew exactly where. That changed in 2013. The Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory, known as HURL, H-U-R-L, was conducting survey operations off the coast of Oahu. And at approximately 700 meters, or 2,300 feet, their submersible's cameras picked up something large on the ocean floor. This is the I-401, lying where the U.S. Navy put it in 1946. More than 70 years on the ocean floor. What you're looking at here is the pressure hull, the outer skin of a submarine that once crossed the Pacific carrying aircraft designed to bomb the United States. Another point of interest was how intact it is. At 2,300 feet, there are no currents, no wave action, and no marine salvage operations. The I-401 has been preserved almost exactly as it was scuttled. The hangar section, where the 3 Seiran bombers would have been stored, it's still recognizable. Because once you see it at this depth, you understand something the history books don't quite capture. This wasn't a failed experiment by Japan. This was a working weapon system that reached the edge of deployment. And the reason it never fired isn't that it couldn't, it's that the war ended first. And there's something about seeing it on the ocean floor, deliberately sunk, deliberately hidden, that tells you more about the end of World War II than most textbooks do. The Americans didn't just win the war, they won the technology race, and they made sure the competition couldn't start again.
The I-401, it never completed its mission. It never launched a single aircraft in combat. It surrendered without firing a weapon. And then it was deliberately torpedoed in the Pacific by the country it was built to attack. And that's the part of this story we rarely talk about.